My stepson took over the CEO office 3 days after my wife passed away and fired me on the spot. He thought he was getting rid of an obsolete relic from the inner city. He had no idea I own 90% of the voting shares for the entire corporation. Monday morning is going to be a very harsh awakening. My name is Howard. I am 70 years old, and I have learned that true power never needs to raise its voice. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who severely underestimated your worth. The scent of lilies from Diane's funeral still lingered on my dark wool coat as I stepped out of the corporate elevator. It had been exactly 3 days since I buried the only woman I ever loved. I walked down the long corridor toward the executive suite I had designed over 30 years ago. The glass walls offered a clear view of the operations floor below a bustling hub of logistics I had built from nothing but a single rusted delivery truck. I kept my posture rigid and my expression entirely unreadable. I have survived poverty, systemic redlining, and the brutal sudden loss of my wife. I was not going to show an ounce of weakness to a boy who had never worked a hard day in his life. I pushed open the heavy double doors to the corner office. Wesley sat behind the massive mahogany desk. He occupied Diane's high-backed leather chair with an unearned sense of authority. He wore a tailored suit that cost more than the down payment on my first home. His white wife, Abigail, stood by the floor-to-ceiling window. She held a porcelain cup of artisan coffee and stared down at the Chicago traffic with a look of supreme boredom. Neither of them offered me a seat. Neither of them offered a single word of condolence for the woman who had given Wesley his entire privileged existence. Wesley folded his hands on top of the immaculate desk. He did not look me in the eye. Instead, he slid a single crisp sheet of paper across the polished mahogany surface. He cleared his throat and adjusted his expensive silk tie. He told me the company was moving in a modern, aggressive direction and that they needed fresh blood to appeal to new investors. He stated that my position as senior consultant was officially and immediately eliminated. I looked down at the document. It was a standard corporate termination notice. It offered a meager 2-week severance package in exchange for a full non-disclosure agreement. 40 years of my life summarized in 14 days of minimum executive pay. I did not raise my voice. I did not remind him that Diane was the brilliant public face of this corporation, but I was the structural architect who laid its actual foundation. I simply stared at the paper. Abigail turned away from the window. She stepped forward, allowing her expensive heels to click sharply against the hardwood floor. She offered a tight, patronizing smile that did not reach her cold eyes. She told me I should view this termination as a blessing rather than an insult. She crossed her arms and scrutinized my simple, functional attire. Abigail declared that I came from a very different world than they did, and that I severely lacked the formal business education required to navigate the current tech-driven market. She spoke to me slowly and clearly, as if I were an uneducated janitor who had accidentally wandered onto the executive floor and needed directions to the exit. She reminded me that Diane was a visionary who had carried me along out of a misguided sense of charity. But charity had no place in a modern enterprise. She explicitly insulted my working-class origins. She told me the logistics industry was no longer about moving boxes on trucks, but about algorithms and digital integration. According to Abigail, an old man with dirt under his fingernails had absolutely nothing left to contribute. She pointed to the termination notice on the desk. She instructed me to take the small payout and go find a nice, quiet apartment in my old neighborhood on the south side. She suggested I buy a comfortable armchair, watch television, and leave the heavy lifting of corporate governance to the highly educated professionals. Her arrogance was suffocating, built entirely on the wealth my labor had generated. She assumed my silence was a symptom of shock or intellectual deficit. She believed I was completely paralyzed by the sudden loss of my wife and the loss of my supposed job. She had absolutely no idea that I held 90% of the silent voting shares of the holding corporation. She did not know Diane held only 10% to maintain her CEO status for public relations purposes. Wesley inherited his mother's 10% and genuinely believed he owned the world. They both believed they were excising a useless parasite from their shiny new empire. Abigail took a sip of her coffee and gave a dismissive wave of her hand. She told me to sign the paper quickly so they could prepare the office for the new executive they had hired from a prestigious firm. Her disrespect was a calculated tactic designed to make me feel entirely powerless. I did not argue with Abigail. I did not demand respect from Wesley. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my favorite silver pen. I leaned over the mahogany desk and signed my name on the bottom line of the termination notice. Wesley let out a highly audible sigh of relief. He immediately snatched the document back across the desk before the ink was even dry. He instructed me to leave my corporate security badge on the table. He added that building security would escort me to the ground floor and that human resources would mail my personal belongings to my home address later in the week. I unclipped the plastic lanyard from my belt and placed the badge silently beside his hand. I turned my back on my stepson and his manipulative wife. I walked out of the executive suite, stepped into the private elevator, and descended to the lobby in absolute silence. I did not mourn the loss of the job. I mourned the harsh realization that my late wife's son had completely rotted from the inside out, corrupted entirely by unearned wealth. I stepped out of the corporate headquarters and flagged down a passing taxi. I directed the driver to my private family estate on the edge of the city. I needed to sit in Diane's garden. I needed an hour of quiet reflection to process the profound betrayal I had just experienced. I needed to grieve the death of my wife without the suffocating presence of corporate vultures. The peace I sought did not arrive. The taxi pulled up to the heavy wrought iron gates of my property. 2 large commercial moving vans were parked directly in my circular driveway. 4 men in gray work uniforms were actively dismantling the heavy oak front door of my house. I paid the taxi driver, stepped out of the vehicle, and walked up the stone pathway. I saw a commercial locksmith drilling out the deadbolt I had installed myself 20 years ago. The termination at the office had been a calculated distraction. Wesley and Abigail were executing a synchronized strike to strip me of everything I possessed. I stood on the walkway, watching strangers tear apart the physical threshold of the home I had shared with Diane. The profound disrespect ignited a cold, focused clarity within my mind. I walked up the stone pathway toward the front door. The lead locksmith, a burly man with grease on his overalls, barely glanced my way as he continued drilling the brass deadbolt. I stood firmly in the center of my own porch and demanded an explanation for the destruction of my property. Before the locksmith could speak, the front door swung open from the inside. Abigail stepped out onto the porch, clutching a leather folder tightly against her chest. Her expression radiated absolute triumph. She did not lower her voice or attempt to hide her actions from the hired crew. She loudly declared that the property no longer belonged to me. Abigail proudly opened the folder and presented a legal document. She stated that Diane's final will explicitly left the entire estate to Wesley. She claimed that Wesley had authorized the immediate transfer of the deed into her private LLC. According to her, I was merely a temporary guest whose welcome had expired. She informed me that she had graciously allotted 10 minutes for me to pack a single suitcase. She threatened to call the local police precinct and press criminal trespassing charges if I remained on the property 1 minute longer. Her arrogance was staggering. She firmly believed she held all the cards. She believed the paperwork in her hands granted her absolute sovereignty over my life. I did not engage in a shouting match. I did not attempt to explain the complex legal reality to a woman blinded by unearned power. I simply nodded, bypassed her on the porch, and walked into the house. I moved deliberately through the familiar hallways. I had purchased this land 40 years ago, when it was nothing but an overgrown lot. I had hired the architects, approved the blueprints, and supervised the pouring of the foundation. I had placed the estate in Diane's name during the late 1980s to shield our assets from a frivolous, predatory lawsuit aimed at the company. It was a strategic legal maneuver an act of absolute trust between a husband and a wife. Wesley and Abigail believed they had inherited a windfall. They did not understand that Diane's will only transferred the superficial title, while the foundational trust explicitly protected my lifetime residency and ultimate ownership. I did not pack my clothes. I bypassed the master bedroom entirely and entered my private ground-floor study. I closed the door and moved the heavy mahogany desk to the side. I lifted the edge of the antique Persian rug to reveal a seamless metal panel flush with the hardwood floor. I entered the numerical combination and opened the hidden floor safe. I extracted my passport, a secondary set of vehicle keys, and a sealed manila envelope containing the original notarized trust documents. I placed the envelope into a small leather satchel. I exited the study, walked back through the foyer, and stepped out onto the porch. Abigail stood by the moving van, monitoring her stopwatch. I did not utter a single word to her. I walked past the dismantled front door down the driveway and hailed another taxi. I directed the driver to a modest, unassuming hotel in the downtown business district. I needed a secure location far removed from the corporate headquarters and the estate. I checked into a standard room under an alias, locked the heavy wooden door, and pulled my encrypted cell phone from my coat pocket. I immediately dialed the direct line of my personal attorney, Mr. Hayes. He was a brilliant, meticulous lawyer who operated strictly in the shadows, handling the complex mechanics of my wealth for over 2 decades. I rapidly outlined the events of the morning. I detailed the termination at the corporate office and the subsequent eviction from the estate. I instructed Mr. Hayes to initiate a complete freeze on all my personal bank accounts to prevent any further unauthorized access by Wesley. Mr. Hayes agreed to execute the freeze protocols immediately. He promised to meet me at the hotel room with a full preliminary status report. I hung up the phone and sat on the edge of the hotel bed. The silence of the room was absolute. I reviewed my strategy, anticipating the legal maneuvers required to dismantle Wesley's aggressive takeover. Exactly 1 hour later, a sharp knock echoed through the room. I opened the door to find Mr. Hayes standing in the hallway. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by visible tension. He stepped inside, quickly locked the door behind him, and placed a thick financial printout on the small desk. Mr. Hayes did not offer any preliminary pleasantries. He stated directly that the bank freeze was irrelevant. He turned the financial report toward me and pointed to a series of bold red transactions. He revealed that my personal checking and savings accounts were completely empty. Wesley had utilized an outdated power of attorney document to systematically drain every single dollar from my private funds yesterday afternoon. The revelation of my empty personal accounts hung in the quiet hotel room like toxic smoke. Mr. Hayes expected an outburst. He expected a grieving widower to break down and scream at the sheer audacity of the theft. I did not give him that satisfaction. I simply stared at the printed bank statements proving Wesley had weaponized a decade-old medical power of attorney to completely drain my life savings. I felt a cold knot tighten in my chest. A man does not steal a few $100,000 from his grieving stepfather unless he is attempting to plug a much larger, far more catastrophic financial hole. I instructed Mr. Hayes to close the personal banking file and immediately access the central corporate registry. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before opening his heavily encrypted laptop. He connected to the secure mainframe I had paid millions to develop for our supply chain logistics network. His fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, bypassing the standard executive firewalls to reach the core financial ledger. The screen illuminated the dark hotel room with a harsh white glow. Mr. Hayes ran a rapid diagnostic script to isolate unauthorized external transfers made within the last 6 months. The resulting data materialized on the screen in a cascading wall of red numbers. The sheer scale of the hemorrhage was breathtaking. Wesley had not merely skimmed profits from the operational budget. He had systematically breached the employee pension fund. Millions of dollars were missing, routed through a complex web of shell companies and offshore holding accounts. I leaned closer to the monitor, analyzing the specific transfer dates and routing numbers. Mr. Hayes cross-referenced the destination accounts with a secure federal tracking database he maintained for high-level corporate litigation. The truth materialized with sickening clarity. Wesley had not invested the stolen pension funds into failing tech startups or misguided expansion projects. He had funneled every single stolen dollar into massive illegal sports betting syndicates. My stepson had gambled away the retirement security of the men and women who drove my trucks, operated my forklifts, and managed my warehouses. He had used the lifeblood of my working-class employees to finance his severe gambling addiction. The personal theft of my savings was just a desperate last-minute attempt to cover a margin call. The company was financially hollowed out, bleeding to death from 1,000 silent digital wounds inflicted by a man who had never earned a single paycheck through honest labor. I refused to let my wife's legacy be destroyed by a degenerate coward. I ordered Mr. Hayes to dig deeper into the executive communication logs. A thief only empties a corporate pension fund if he believes he can permanently erase the evidence before the inevitable federal audit. Mr. Hayes ran a keyword sweep through Wesley's encrypted email servers. Within minutes, he isolated a highly classified, fast-tracked acquisition portfolio. Wesley had brokered a clandestine deal to sell the entire logistics company to a ruthless private equity firm known for aggressive corporate raiding. The terms of the pending contract were devastating. The buyers were acquiring the network for a fraction of its actual market value. In exchange for the severe discount, the private equity firm agreed to absorb all internal financial discrepancies without initiating a prior forensic audit. Wesley was essentially selling my life's work at a massive loss simply to bury his embezzlement crimes permanently. Mr. Hayes highlighted the execution date at the bottom of the digital contract. The final signatures were scheduled for Monday morning at 9 o'clock. If that document was ratified, the private equity firm would immediately dismantle the corporate infrastructure to liquidate its physical assets. The resulting fallout would be catastrophic. The new owners would instantly terminate 400 local workers. These were not faceless statistics. These were the men and women from my own community. I had hired their parents. I had attended their weddings. I had personally guaranteed their financial security when I built this company from a single delivery route. Wesley was perfectly willing to destroy 400 families just to save himself from a federal prison sentence. The stakes had instantly shifted from a personal real estate dispute into a fight for the survival of my people. I could tolerate the loss of my house and the theft of my private bank accounts. I could rebuild my personal wealth from scratch if necessary. But I absolutely refused to allow an arrogant, degenerate gambler to sacrifice my employees on the altar of his own incompetence. I told Mr. Hayes to close the communication logs. I did not need to see any more of Wesley's pathetic correspondence. The situation required immediate, overwhelming retaliation. I needed to crush the acquisition deal before the buyers even walked into the boardroom on Monday morning. My legacy was not going to be dismantled and sold for scrap to protect a criminal. I opened my own secure laptop and placed it on the small wooden desk next to Mr. Hayes. I informed my attorney that Wesley's impending sale was legally impossible without my explicit authorization. I finally revealed the true architecture of our corporate structure. When I formally incorporated the business 40 years ago, I installed Diane as the public-facing chief executive officer with 10% of the public shares. Her presence satisfied the investors and managed the public relations perfectly. However, I retained 90% of the silent voting shares through a deeply guarded private holding trust. Wesley had inherited his mother's 10% operating under the arrogant delusion that he possessed total authority over the empire. He did not know that I held the absolute power to dissolve the board veto any corporate sale and terminate his employment with a single keystroke. I navigated to the company's internal administrative portal. I meticulously typed in my unique alphanumeric credentials to access the master registry. My intention was to officially log a hard veto against the private equity merger and immediately suspend Wesley's executive privileges pending a comprehensive criminal investigation. I pressed the Enter key, fully expecting the familiar green confirmation screen to validate my command. Instead, the monitor flashed a brilliant, blinding crimson. A harsh error message materialized in bold text, declaring that my administrative access was entirely denied. I instructed Mr. Hayes to run a backdoor diagnostic on my master profile. His fingers flew across his keyboard as he tapped into the system's root directory to trace the anomaly. The results were immediate and disastrous. Wesley had anticipated my interference. Operating under his newly assumed role as Chief Executive Officer, he had completely purged my credentials from the digital architecture. He had utilized an aggressive cybersecurity protocol to erase my silent shares from the active digital registry. The computer network had essentially wiped my 40-year operational history entirely clean. According to the internal servers, I held absolutely no authority, no voting power, and no corporate equity whatsoever. In the eyes of the digital corporate system, I simply did not exist. I stared at the flashing red screen, realizing the absolute magnitude of the obstacle standing directly before me. Wesley had locked the digital doors, believing he had successfully severed my final connection to the company. He had severely underestimated my foresight. Mr. Hayes closed his laptop with a sharp snap that echoed in the quiet hotel room. The digital blockade was complete and legally unassailable from a remote terminal. He looked across the small desk and stated the grim reality of corporate law. A digital purge initiated by an active chief executive officer is considered legally binding until a court explicitly orders a technical reversal. We did not have the luxury of waiting weeks for a cyber forensics team to rebuild my deleted administrative profile. Mr. Hayes explained that there was only one legal mechanism powerful enough to override a digital lockout instantly. Federal corporate law requires physical ink signatures on original notarized founding charters to supersede an executive digital mandate. If I could present the physical shares to a federal judge, the digital lockout would be rendered entirely void. The problem was the location of those documents. 30 years ago, I had insisted on constructing a climate-controlled titanium vault deep within the basement of the corporate headquarters. The original stock certificates, the founding charter, and the complete physical history of the company were secured behind 12 inches of reinforced steel. Wesley had stolen my digital identity, but he did not have the mechanical combination to the physical vault. The documents were safe, but they were trapped inside a building I was no longer legally permitted to enter. I pulled a blank notepad from the desk drawer and began sketching a rough architectural outline of the corporate headquarters. Mr. Hayes watched in silence as I mapped out the primary security checkpoints, the camera blind spots, and the structural load-bearing walls. When I originally purchased the downtown lot 40 years ago, I did not have the capital to hire a massive construction firm. I laid the initial concrete foundation with my own hands. I personally welded the steel beams that supported the first 3 floors before the company expanded, and we hired professional contractors. During that initial phase, I engineered a subterranean maintenance tunnel designed to channel heavy industrial cables away from the main utility grid. The tunnel connected directly to an adjacent abandoned subway access point. Over the decades, the modern security grid was built entirely around the upper floors and the primary basement corridors. The old maintenance tunnel was completely off the digital grid, forgotten by the new generation of corporate architects. I pointed to the crude drawing of the subway access point. I explained to Mr. Hayes that I could bypass the entire modern security apparatus by entering through the old service tunnel. The path led directly to the utility closet situated exactly 20 feet from the titanium vault. It was a risky maneuver for a 70-year-old man, but I was not going to let a spoiled child steal my legacy simply because he knew how to manipulate a computer. I stood up from the desk and opened my small suitcase. I retrieved a heavy dark wool sweater, a pair of durable work boots, and a small high-powered industrial flashlight. I informed Mr. Hayes that I would execute the breach at exactly midnight. The city financial district would be empty, and the night shift security rotation was notoriously lax on weekends. I instructed him to remain at the hotel and prepare the federal injunction documents. I needed the paperwork ready for the judge the moment I returned with the physical shares. I checked the battery on my flashlight and moved toward the hotel room door. Before I could turn the handle, Mr. Hayes's encrypted cell phone vibrated violently against the desk. He picked up the device and read the incoming notification. The color drained from his face. He looked up from the screen and delivered a critical update. Abigail had not relied on the standard corporate security team. She had utilized the stolen pension funds to hire an elite, heavily armed private mercenary firm to guard the building throughout the entire weekend. The alert indicated that the new security detail had locked down all external access points. Furthermore, they had stationed 2 armed guards permanently outside the basement vault. The timeline was now catastrophically compressed, and the physical danger had escalated to a potentially lethal level. My own company was heavily fortified against me. I did not allow the sudden escalation of physical danger to alter my strategy. A corporate lockdown designed by a private equity security firm relies entirely on modern digital sensors and predictable architectural choke points. They secure the glass doors, the loading docks, and the executive elevators. They do not secure what they do not know exists. I thanked Mr. Hayes for the intelligence and instructed him to have the federal injunction drafted and ready for a judge's signature by dawn. I stepped out of the hotel room into the biting chill of the midnight air. I wore the heavy dark wool sweater and the steel-toed work boots I had packed for this exact necessity. I walked 3 blocks to the downtown transit hub and descended into the subterranean subway network. The station was largely deserted at this hour. I bypassed the main passenger platforms and navigated toward the northern maintenance corridor. 40 years ago, when I first purchased the land for the logistics headquarters, the city required me to reinforce the shared subterranean retaining wall between my property and the municipal transit line. I poured that concrete myself. I laid the rebar and welded the structural supports to save capital for my first fleet of delivery trucks. During that excavation, I integrated a narrow service conduit to allow immediate access to the municipal power grid. It was an oversight by the city inspectors, and it became my permanent, undocumented entry point. I reached the end of the subway maintenance tunnel. A rusted iron grate blocked the passage. I retrieved a specialized wrench from my coat pocket and systematically loosened the 4 oxidized bolts holding the barrier in place. The heavy metal shifted with a dull scrape. I set the grate aside and squeezed my broad shoulders through the narrow opening. I clicked on my industrial flashlight. The beam cut through decades of undisturbed dust and hanging cobwebs. The air inside the passage was heavy, thick with the scent of damp concrete and old machine oil. I moved forward with deliberate, measured steps. My knees ached from the damp cold, but my mind was sharply focused. I ran my gloved hand along the rough concrete wall, feeling the familiar ridges and imperfections I had smoothed out with my own trowel 4 decades ago. I knew every incline and every structural pillar of this passage. The tunnel sloped upward, leading directly beneath the modern headquarters. Above me, heavily armed mercenaries were actively patrolling the polished marble floors. Down here, I was completely invisible. I reached the heavy steel utility door that separated the forgotten tunnel from the active sub-basement of the corporate facility. I switched off my flashlight and pressed my ear against the cold metal, listening for any sign of movement on the other side. The faint, rhythmic thud of heavy tactical boots echoed through the steel door. I held my breath and waited in absolute darkness. The footsteps grew louder, passed directly by the utility room, and slowly faded down the adjacent corridor. The mercenaries were running a standard perimeter sweep. Their patrol patterns were disciplined but entirely predictable. I gripped the heavy iron latch of the utility door. I applied steady, even pressure to prevent the rusted hinges from squeaking. The door opened just enough for me to slip through the gap. I stepped into the climate-controlled basement of my own company. The contrast between the damp tunnel and the sterile corporate environment was jarring. I moved silently along the edge of the hallway, using the shadows cast by the massive climate control units to mask my silhouette. I reached the intersection leading to the central archives. 2 armed guards stood 30 yards away, conversing in low tones near the freight elevator. I memorized their positions and slipped into the adjacent server room. I navigated through the labyrinth of data racks, emerging through a secondary maintenance hatch located directly behind the primary security desk. I bypassed the guards entirely and stepped into the secure corridor housing the titanium vault. The vault door was a massive, intimidating slab of reinforced steel. Wesley had undoubtedly changed the digital keypad codes the moment he terminated my employment. However, digital security is ultimately subservient to physical engineering. When I commissioned the vault 30 years ago, I demanded a mechanical failsafe to protect against total grid failures or cyber attacks. The manufacturer installed a hidden combination dial concealed beneath a magnetic steel plate on the lower right frame. I dropped to my knees and pressed my gloved fingers against the smooth metal casing. I located the subtle indentation and slid the magnetic plate aside to reveal the heavy brass dial. I had memorized the override combination the day the vault was installed. I never wrote it down. I spun the dial with surgical precision. 3 turns right to 42, 2 turns left to 17, 1 turn right to 86. I grasped the heavy steel handle and pulled downward. The internal locking mechanisms retracted with a heavy, satisfying metallic clank. The titanium door swung outward silently. I had breached the impenetrable fortress. I stepped inside the vault and pulled the heavy door shut behind me, leaving it slightly ajar to prevent a permanent lockout. I clicked my flashlight back on and illuminated the rows of secure deposit boxes. I moved directly to the rear wall and unlocked my personal archive drawer. I reached inside and withdrew a thick, heavy leather binder. This binder did not contain digital approximations or corporate algorithms. It contained the original physical stock certificates bearing the authentic signatures of the founding board. It was the undeniable ink and paper proof of my 90% ownership. I ran my hand over the embossed leather cover. Wesley believed he could erase me with a simple computer command. He was about to learn that real power is grounded in physical reality, not digital illusions. I carefully secured the leather binder inside my satchel and adjusted the shoulder strap. I prepared to exit the vault and retrace my path through the maintenance tunnel. Suddenly, the low murmur of human voices drifted down from the ceiling. I froze. I deactivated my flashlight and stood in perfect silence. The sound was channeling through the large aluminum ventilation shaft positioned directly above the vault. The acoustics of the building ductwork amplified the conversation taking place in the ground floor executive office. I recognized the voices immediately. It was Wesley and Abigail. They were not discussing the impending sale of the logistics company. They were locked in a heated, frantic argument. I moved silently until I stood directly beneath the ventilation grate. I strained to hear their exact words. Abigail's voice was sharp and laced with severe anxiety. She was aggressively questioning Wesley about a secondary, highly lucrative life insurance policy he had secretly taken out on Diane 6 months ago. Wesley snapped back, demanding she lower her voice. He stated that the payout from the insurance policy was absolutely necessary to cover the immediate interest on his gambling debts before the private equity sale finalized on Monday. He complained that the insurance company investigators were deliberately stalling the payout. Abigail's voice trembled with poorly concealed panic. She warned him that the insurance investigators were demanding a deeper review of Diane's sudden heart failure. The conversation shifted from a corporate dispute into something vastly more sinister. My blood ran cold as I stood in the dark listening to my stepson discuss his mother's death with the cold calculation of a cornered criminal. I stood completely motionless in the shadows of the basement vault corridor. The heavy titanium door remained slightly ajar behind me, but my entire focus shifted upward to the aluminum ventilation shaft. The voices echoing down the metal ductwork belonged unmistakably to my stepson Wesley and his wife Abigail. I reached into my dark wool sweater and retrieved my encrypted cell phone. I bypassed the lock screen and immediately activated the high-definition voice recording application. I raised my arm and pressed the microphone directly against the cold metal grate of the vent. The acoustics of the corporate duct system amplified their conversation with chilling clarity. Abigail sounded frantic. Her expensive heels paced rapidly across the hardwood floor of the executive office above me. She complained bitterly that the private insurance investigator was becoming a severe liability. She stated that the investigator had called her 3 times today, demanding detailed medical records from Diane's primary cardiologist. Abigail's voice pitched higher with anxiety as she paced. She explained that the insurance company was refusing to release the $5 million payout for Diane's life insurance policy. The investigator was officially flagging the claim due to the sudden and highly irregular nature of Diane's fatal heart failure. Diane had been exceptionally healthy for a woman her age. She had passed a comprehensive physical examination just 2 months prior to her death. The insurance adjuster found it highly suspicious that a woman with a perfectly managed mild cardiac condition would suddenly suffer a massive unprovoked myocardial infarction in her sleep. Abigail snapped at Wesley, demanding to know why the coroner had not simply signed the death certificate without asking secondary questions. She paced faster, her voice echoing down the shaft. She revealed that the investigator was now demanding to see the specific pill bottles retrieved from Diane's nightstand on the morning of her death. Abigail was terrified that the insurance firm was preparing to launch a full forensic toxicology panel. She warned Wesley that if the federal authorities got involved in a fraud investigation, the private equity firm would immediately cancel the impending corporate buyout on Monday morning. The entire financial house of cards they had built was resting on the assumption that Diane's death would be categorized as an unfortunate but entirely natural tragedy. The tension in Abigail's voice revealed a profound desperation. She was not grieving a lost mother-in-law. She was panicking over a delayed paycheck. I held my phone steady against the grate, ensuring every single syllable of her frantic complaint was captured in pristine digital audio. Wesley's voice cut through Abigail's panic with a sharp, dismissive command. He ordered his wife to stop pacing and to sit down immediately. He spoke with the cold, arrogant certainty of a man who believed he had executed a flawless strategy. He assured Abigail that the insurance investigator was merely performing standard procedural diligence required for high-value claims. Wesley told her to maintain her composure and to play the role of the devastated daughter-in-law. He promised her that no toxicology report would ever flag the chemical anomaly. I adjusted my grip on the cell phone, pressing the microphone tighter against the aluminum grate. Wesley lowered his voice, but the metal ductwork carried his sinister confession directly to my ears. He explicitly detailed exactly how he had secured their financial future. He admitted that he had systematically emptied the capsules of Diane's prescribed blood pressure medication. He meticulously refilled those same pharmaceutical capsules with a highly concentrated dose of a synthetic stimulant he had procured through his illegal gambling connections. Wesley laughed a low, guttural laugh. He boasted about slipping into our private estate while I was out managing the logistics yard. He swapped the tampered bottles on Diane's nightstand just hours before she went to sleep. He explained that the synthetic stimulant was designed to violently accelerate the heart rate, mimicking the exact physiological symptoms of a massive natural heart attack. Furthermore, the chemical compound was specifically engineered to metabolize and dissolve into the bloodstream within hours, leaving absolutely no trace for a standard coroner to find. Wesley proudly declared that he had actively murdered his own mother to expedite his corporate inheritance. He stated that waiting for her to pass away, naturally, would have taken another decade, and his sports betting creditors were threatening to break his legs if he did not produce millions of dollars by Monday. He rationalized the murder as a necessary business transaction to secure the company and save his own life. He assured Abigail that the tampered pill bottles were already incinerated and that they had committed the perfect untraceable crime. I captured every horrific premeditated detail on my digital recorder. A profound, crushing agony seized my chest. The cold concrete floor beneath my boots seemed to drop away. My wife, the brilliant and compassionate woman I had loved for 4 decades, had not died from a tragic failing of her heart. Diane had been brutally, intentionally murdered in her own bed by the child she had brought into this world. A violent, white-hot rage flared behind my eyes. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to abandon my stealth. I wanted to kick down the basement doors, march up the executive staircase, and strangle the life out of Wesley with my bare hands. I wanted to hear his bones snap and watch the arrogance drain from his eyes. I stood trembling beneath the ventilation shaft, fighting the most intense physical urge to commit immediate violence. But I am not a man who operates on unchecked emotion. I am an architect of logistics, a man who built an empire through absolute discipline and strategic foresight. Unleashing my fury tonight would only result in my arrest and allow Wesley to finalize the corporate sale on Monday. I forced myself to breathe slowly, inhaling the damp, metallic air of the basement. I lowered my arm and tapped the screen of my encrypted phone. I formally saved the audio file to the secure local drive and immediately initiated an encrypted backup transfer to Mr. Hayes's private server. The digital evidence of premeditated murder was now locked away safely. I adjusted the heavy leather satchel containing the original physical stock certificates over my shoulder. I turned away from the ventilation shaft and the titanium vault. I slipped back into the dark maintenance corridor, pulling the heavy steel utility door completely shut behind me. I navigated the narrow subterranean passage with silent, methodical steps, leaving the corporate headquarters exactly as I had found it. I reached the rusted iron grate at the end of the tunnel and squeezed my shoulders back through the narrow opening. I emerged into the desolate subway access point, pulling myself up the concrete stairs toward the street level. I stepped out into the dark, freezing alleyway adjacent to the corporate building, ready to disappear into the city shadows. The moment my boots touched the wet asphalt of the alleyway, the world erupted in blinding light. A high-intensity halogen spotlight mounted on a local police cruiser snapped on, pinning my silhouette against the brick wall. The harsh glare momentarily blinded me. A patrol officer stepped out from behind the reinforced door of the cruiser. He unholstered his service weapon, leveled it directly at my chest, and shouted a sharp, aggressive command for me to freeze and raise my hands immediately. I raised my empty hands slowly, keeping my movements deliberate and completely unthreatening. The young patrol officer stepped further out of the harsh glare of the cruiser's halogen spotlight. He gripped his service weapon tightly, pointing the barrel directly at the center of my chest. He shouted a sharp command for me to interlock my fingers behind my head and turn around to face the brick wall. I did exactly as I was told. I have lived 70 years as an African-American man in this country, and I know exactly how quickly a tense encounter in a dark alley can escalate into a fatal misunderstanding. I kept my breathing even and my voice completely flat. I informed the officer that I was unarmed and that my identification was located in the interior breast pocket of my wool sweater. The officer advanced cautiously, keeping his weapon trained on my back. He patted down my sides, feeling the heavy leather satchel slung securely across my shoulder. He demanded to know what I was doing, lurking in the restricted service alley of a corporate headquarters at this hour of the night. I did not offer a complex or defensive excuse. I simply stated that I was an older man who had taken a wrong turn after missing the last train at the adjacent transit hub. It was a plausible, mundane explanation designed to lower his adrenaline. The officer yanked the wallet from my pocket and stepped back into the harsh illumination of the cruiser's headlights. He flipped open my leather billfold and extracted my driver's license. He keyed the microphone attached to his tactical vest and read my full legal name and date of birth to the precinct dispatcher. I remained perfectly still against the freezing brick wall. I was not worried about a standard background check. My criminal record was completely spotless. I had spent 4 decades building a legitimate empire and paying my taxes. I fully expected the dispatcher to clear my name, allowing the officer to issue a stern warning and send me on my way. I waited in the cold air, mentally calculating the quickest route back to the downtown hotel, where Mr. Hayes was currently drafting the federal injunction. The static crackle of the police radio shattered the quiet tension of the alleyway. The dispatcher's voice came back through the external speaker of the cruiser, loud and crystal clear in the freezing night air. She did not issue a standard clearance code. Instead, she ordered the patrol unit to exercise extreme caution immediately. The dispatcher announced that there was an active high-priority psychiatric warrant attached to my name. She read the details of the alert over the open channel for the officer to hear. A supposedly concerned family member had contacted the authorities earlier that evening to file a severe medical distress report. The caller was Abigail. She had provided the police with a highly detailed, completely fabricated narrative, claiming that her elderly father-in-law was suffering from rapidly advancing dementia. She officially reported that I had experienced a violent psychotic break following the sudden death of my wife. According to Abigail's false police report, I was severely delusional, heavily disoriented, and had actively threatened to physically harm my own family members. The dispatcher instructed the officer to detain me immediately for a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric evaluation at the state medical facility. The young officer's entire demeanor instantly shifted. The aggressive suspicion of a potential burglar vanished completely, replaced by the cautious, rigid protocol used to handle a highly unpredictable mental patient. He slowly holstered his service weapon and retrieved a heavy pair of steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He instructed me to keep my hands flat on the brick wall and spoke in a slow, patronizing tone, telling me that he was simply going to take me to a hospital to get some necessary help. The sheer, calculated malice of Abigail's strategy hit me with the force of a physical blow. Wesley and his wife had not merely locked me out of my house and drained my personal bank accounts. They had actively weaponized the legal and medical systems against me. They knew that if I somehow found a way to challenge their corporate takeover, they needed a preemptive method to completely invalidate my credibility. A federal judge would never grant a corporate injunction to a man currently locked inside a psychiatric ward under a heavy dementia watch. If this young officer placed those steel cuffs on my wrists, I would be heavily sedated and isolated in a locked clinical room until well past Monday morning. Wesley would effortlessly execute the sale of the logistics company, destroy 400 local jobs, and secure his stolen millions, while I was trapped in a hospital bed legally stripped of my own voice and autonomy. I could not allow myself to be detained. The heavy leather satchel containing the original voting shares of my corporation hung securely against my ribs, alongside my encrypted phone holding the audio confession of my wife's murder. If the police confiscated my belongings during a psychiatric intake, the evidence would be hopelessly entangled in an administrative bureaucracy for weeks. I watched the officer take a slow, measured step toward me, holding the open handcuffs ready. He was young, physically fit, and heavily armored, but he lacked my intimate knowledge of this specific industrial alleyway. I had designed the loading dock infrastructure of this building myself. I knew that directly to my left, hidden in the shadows of the brick column, was the manual emergency release lever for the secondary commercial security gate. As the officer reached out to grab my wrist, I dropped my shoulder and pivoted hard to the left. I drove the heel of my heavy steel-toed work boot directly into the rusted iron release lever protruding from the wall. The heavy counterweighted chain-link security gate slammed downward from the ceiling with a deafening metallic crash. The thick steel mesh dropped violently between us, instantly separating me from the startled patrolman. The officer shouted in surprise and lunged forward, but he was trapped on the street side of the barrier. He grabbed the chain-link mesh and aggressively rattled the gate, demanding that I stop. I did not waste a single second looking back. I sprinted down the narrow confines of the loading tunnel, utilizing the total darkness to mask my escape. I reached the subterranean subway grate I had loosened earlier. I slid through the narrow opening and pulled the heavy iron cover firmly back into place, just as the beam of his flashlight swept frantically across the empty alleyway. I navigated the dark concrete maintenance corridor and merged into the early morning commuter traffic of the main transit hub. I emerged onto the cold city streets miles away from the corporate headquarters. The pale light of Saturday morning was just beginning to bleed across the Chicago skyline. I was now an active wanted fugitive with a psychiatric warrant hanging over my head. I could not safely return to my downtown hotel room, and I could not risk exposing Mr. Hayes to criminal harboring charges. I had to disappear completely into the urban grid and protect the evidence until I could devise a new strategy to contact my attorney. The freezing wind of the early Chicago morning cut through my wool sweater as I navigated the shadowed side streets of the transit hub. I could not use my personal cell phone to make contact. Wesley and Abigail had the financial resources to access localized cellular tracking through their private security firm. I needed an analog solution. I walked 6 blocks east until I located a dilapidated 24-hour laundromat. A rusted payphone hung precariously on the exterior brick wall. I fed a handful of quarters into the slot and dialed a number I had committed to memory 2 decades ago. The line rang 4 times before a gravelly, sleep-heavy voice answered. I identified myself simply. The man on the other end of the line was Marcus, a retired heavy machinery mechanic who operated an independent auto shop on the desolate southern outskirts of the industrial district. He did not ask why I was calling from an untraceable public line at 5 in the morning. He did not ask why my voice carried the distinct edge of a hunted man. 20 years ago, Marcus had severely mismanaged his business and accrued a lethal debt to a violent local syndicate. They had arrived at his garage with baseball bats and a deadline. I intervened, liquidated his debt entirely with my own capital, and legally secured the title of his garage to ensure his permanent independence. I never asked for a single dollar in return. I only asked that if I ever required absolute sanctuary, the door to his shop would be unlocked. I told Marcus that the time to collect on that decades-old promise had officially arrived. He instructed me to take the early commuter rail to the final southern stop and approach the garage from the rear service alley. He promised the bay doors would be open. I hung up the heavy plastic receiver and pulled my collar up against the biting wind. I merged with the early morning shift workers trickling into the train station, effectively becoming a ghost within the waking city. I kept my head bowed, hiding my face beneath the brim of a purchased newsboy cap. Every passing police cruiser sent a spike of calculated adrenaline through my veins. The psychiatric warrant Abigail filed was a ticking time bomb. If any transit officer matched my face to the active database, I would be sedated, strapped to a hospital bed, and silenced indefinitely. I boarded the train, choosing a corner seat facing the exit. The industrial outskirts of the city were a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and abandoned manufacturing plants. I walked 3 miles from the final transit stop, moving exclusively through overgrown service alleys to avoid the main thoroughfares. I finally reached the back perimeter of Marcus's auto shop. The heavy corrugated metal bay door was raised exactly 2 feet off the cracked concrete. I slid underneath the metal barrier and stood up inside the cavernous garage. The familiar scent of motor oil, oxidized steel, and stale coffee instantly flooded my senses. Marcus stood by a dismantled engine block, wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag. He had aged significantly, but his eyes retained a sharp, loyal intelligence. He immediately walked over to the bay door and engaged the heavy mechanical winch. The metal shutters slammed down against the concrete with a deafening crash, sealing us inside. He threw the heavy iron deadbolt and turned to face me. He took one look at my exhausted posture and the heavy leather satchel slung across my chest. He asked absolutely no questions. He gestured toward his private back office, a small room fortified with cinder block walls and reinforced glass. I stepped inside the cramped office. Marcus handed me a mug of black coffee, locked the office door behind me, and returned to his work on the garage floor, standing guard over my temporary fortress. I pulled my encrypted cell phone from my pocket. I sent a single, heavily coded text message to Mr. Hayes, providing a set of geographic coordinates and strict instructions to utilize maximum counter-surveillance protocols. The waiting was excruciating. Every passing hour increased the probability that Wesley's private mercenaries would widen their search grid. It was nearly noon when the heavy metal shutters of the garage rattled. Marcus opened the secondary pedestrian door. Mr. Hayes stepped into the dimly lit garage. The corporate attorney looked entirely out of place in his tailored suit amidst the oil-stained machinery. He entered the back office and locked the door behind him. He removed his glasses and wiped his forehead with a pristine handkerchief. He informed me that the journey to the garage had taken him over 3 hours. Abigail's private security contractors had actively staked out his residential building and his downtown law firm. Hayes had been forced to leave his personal vehicle behind, switch through 3 separate municipal cabs, walk through a crowded underground shopping concourse to break visual contact, and finally rent an untraceable sedan under a corporate alias. He had ensured with absolute certainty that no one had followed him to this sanctuary. Mr. Hayes sat heavily in a frayed vinyl chair across from Marcus's cluttered desk. He opened his briefcase and prepared to review the physical stock certificates required to halt Wesley's corporate sale. I unbuckled the heavy leather satchel and placed the 90% share binder onto the desk. However, I did not open the binder. I stated that the corporate theft was no longer our primary concern. I pulled my encrypted cell phone from my pocket, navigated to the secure audio files, and placed the device between us. I pressed play. The pristine digital recording of Wesley and Abigail arguing in the ground floor executive office filled the cramped room. Mr. Hayes sat perfectly still as he listened to Abigail's frantic complaints about the life insurance investigator. The color drained entirely from the lawyer's face when Wesley's arrogant, calculated voice echoed from the small speaker. We sat in absolute silence as my stepson explicitly confessed to emptying Diane's blood pressure capsules and replacing them with a lethal, untraceable synthetic stimulant. We listened to the man boast about murdering his own mother to expedite his inheritance and cover his massive gambling debts. The recording ended, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. Mr. Hayes slowly removed his glasses. His hands were trembling slightly. He looked at me with profound horror and realization. He stated firmly that our legal strategy had permanently shifted. We were no longer navigating a hostile corporate takeover or a civil dispute regarding stolen pension funds. We were holding the definitive, unassailable evidence of a capital premeditated murder. Wesley was a highly motivated killer, and Abigail was an active accessory after the fact. Mr. Hayes emphasized that we had to strike with absolute, overwhelming legal force. To stop the merger on Monday morning, we still needed a federal judge to sign an immediate freezing injunction based on the physical stock certificates. The injunction would instantly invalidate Wesley's authority and freeze the corporate assets, trapping him inside the company before he could flee the country. However, Mr. Hayes pointed to the calendar hanging on the cinder-block wall. It was Saturday afternoon. The federal courthouse was entirely locked down. The legal system operates on a strict bureaucratic schedule. Absolutely no federal judge works on Sunday. We were running out of time, and the men who murdered my wife were hours away from escaping with millions. Mr. Hayes stared at the calendar hanging on the cinder-block wall of the auto shop, stating the absolute impossibility of our situation. The federal courthouse was entirely locked down for the weekend, and securing a signature on a Saturday afternoon was statistically impossible. I corrected his assumption immediately. I told him that the bureaucratic machinery of the legal system closes on the weekends, but debts of honor do not. 35 years ago, the regional transport routes in this city were fiercely contested territories. A highly organized shipping cartel had attempted to infiltrate my logistics network to move contraband across state lines undetected. They offered lucrative bribes, and when I flatly refused, they threatened extreme violence against my drivers and my fleet. I did not bend to their intimidation. Instead, I quietly gathered duplicate shipping manifests, altered routing logs, and untraceable vehicle registration data. I compiled a massive cache of physical evidence and handed it directly to a young, fiercely ambitious assistant federal prosecutor who was desperately trying to build a racketeering case against the cartel. His superiors had explicitly told him he lacked the concrete evidence to secure a conviction. I provided the final nail in their coffin. That young prosecutor built his entire reputation and subsequent career on the resulting convictions. He never forgot the man who risked his own life to hand him the keys to the cartel's destruction. That prosecutor was Thomas Sterling. Today, Thomas Sterling is a senior federal district judge for the Northern District. I explained to Mr. Hayes that Judge Sterling owes me a debt, that profoundly transcends standard courtroom hours. Hayes looked highly skeptical. Approaching a federal judge at his private residence on a weekend over a corporate dispute is highly irregular and borders on legal contempt. I reminded Hayes that we were no longer dealing with a simple corporate dispute. We were actively dealing with a premeditated murder, and we held the undeniable physical proof. Hayes nodded slowly, closing his briefcase with a sharp snap. We waited inside the hidden office of the garage until nightfall. Under the cover of total darkness, we left Marcus's shop. Hayes drove the rented sedan, cautiously sticking strictly to the speed limit and utilizing evasive driving maneuvers to avoid major tollway cameras. We headed toward the affluent, quiet northern suburbs. The streets were lined with ancient oak trees and sprawling manicured estates. We pulled up to a heavy wrought iron gate securing Judge Sterling's property. A private security vehicle was parked just inside the perimeter. 2 armed off-duty police officers handled the judge's personal security detail. I stepped out of the vehicle into the biting cold air. The security guards immediately stepped out of their vehicle, their hands resting cautiously near their duty weapons. They demanded we leave the private driveway, immediately citing trespassing laws. I did not back down or show any hesitation. I stood directly in the blinding glare of their headlights and instructed them to call the main house. I told them to give Judge Sterling a highly specific message. Tell him the man who provided the ledger for the southern shipping docks is standing at his front gate. The guards hesitated, exchanging an uncertain look. One of them reluctantly unclipped the radio from his tactical vest and contacted the main house. We waited in the freezing cold for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the heavy iron gates slowly swung inward with a low mechanical hum. The guard gestured for us to proceed up the long cobblestone driveway. We parked near the grand entrance of the estate. Judge Sterling was standing in the open doorway, wearing a heavy robe over his sleepwear. He was older now, his hair completely white, but his eyes possessed the exact same sharp, calculating intensity I remembered from decades ago. He did not smile. He simply opened the heavy wooden door wider and gestured for us to enter his private residence. He led us down a quiet hallway and into a large study lined with heavy oak bookshelves and leather-bound legal volumes. I wasted absolutely no time on pleasantries. I opened the heavy leather satchel and placed the physical stock certificates directly onto his polished mahogany desk. I quickly explained the corporate lockout, Wesley's fraudulent digital maneuvers, and the impending sale of my logistics company to a private equity firm on Monday morning. I then presented the financial audits proving Wesley had systematically drained the employee pension funds to finance his massive underground gambling debts. Judge Sterling examined the documents with a severe expression. He acknowledged the blatant financial crimes, but reminded me that these matters typically require a formal evidentiary hearing during standard judicial hours. I placed my encrypted cell phone onto the center of his desk. I told the judge that the financial crimes were merely the prologue. I pressed play. Wesley's voice filled the quiet, scholarly room, coldly detailing exactly how he had emptied Diane's medication capsules and replaced them with a lethal synthetic stimulant. The judge sat perfectly frozen, listening to the horrific, arrogant confession of matricide. When the recording ended, the atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely from judicial annoyance to absolute grave realization. Judge Sterling leaned back slowly in his leather chair. He confirmed that the physical shares validated my corporate ownership, and the audio recording necessitated immediate, overwhelming federal intervention. He agreed to draft the freezing injunction immediately. This legal document would effectively halt the Monday merger, freeze all corporate assets, and trap Wesley inside the company before he could access the funds and flee the country. However, Judge Sterling paused and looked at me with a grim, calculating expression. He warned me that a federal injunction is a completely useless piece of paper if I cannot physically serve it to the board of directors. He pulled up a secure law enforcement database on his laptop and turned the screen toward me. The psychiatric warrant Abigail had filed earlier that evening was flashing on the screen. It was flagged with maximum priority across all local and state law enforcement networks. The judge stated a chilling reality. The moment I stepped foot inside that corporate building on Monday morning, the private security mercenaries and the local police have a legal mandate to detain me on site. If they execute that medical warrant before I can present the injunction to the executives, I will be heavily sedated and locked in a psychiatric ward, and the company will be sold anyway. Judge Sterling kept his eyes locked on the flashing psychiatric warrant on his computer monitor. He stated that local law enforcement officers operate on strict protocol and immediate dispatch orders. If a municipal patrol unit spotted me within a 5-mile radius of the corporate headquarters, they would not pause to listen to a convoluted story about stolen stock certificates and poisoned medication. They would tackle me to the pavement, inject a heavy sedative into my thigh, and transport me directly to a locked ward. Once the state psychiatric bureaucracy absorbed a patient, extracting them required weeks of endless legal maneuvering. Wesley had engineered a flawless trap utilizing the municipal authorities as his personal security force. I stood perfectly still, processing the severe magnitude of the threat. Mr. Hayes wiped a thin layer of sweat from his forehead and asked the judge how we could possibly bypass a mandated medical hold. Judge Sterling closed his laptop with a sharp snap and reached for the secure, heavy black landline sitting on the corner of his mahogany desk. He stated that municipal police departments answer to state judges, but federal crimes supersede state jurisdiction entirely. The pension fund embezzlement involved interstate wire fraud, and the tampered medication constituted a calculated conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain across corporate entities. Judge Sterling picked up the receiver and dialed a direct unlisted number to the local Federal Bureau of Investigation field office. He did not introduce himself with pleasantries. He immediately requested the senior agent in charge of the Financial Crimes Division. When the agent answered, Judge Sterling activated the speakerphone. He formally declared that he possessed undeniable physical evidence of a multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement scheme directly tied to a premeditated homicide. He explained that the primary suspect was utilizing a fraudulent state psychiatric warrant to weaponize local police against the sole surviving witness. The judge instructed the federal agent to bypass the local precinct entirely to prevent any jurisdictional interference or accidental leaks. He demanded immediate federal intervention to secure the witness and halt the impending corporate sale. The voice on the speakerphone remained calm and professional, acknowledging the severity of a direct request from a sitting federal district judge. The agent promised to dispatch a specialized unit immediately to review the material and establish a secure perimeter. We remained in the judge's study throughout the remaining hours of the night. Sleep was an impossible luxury. At exactly 6 a.m, the heavy iron gates of the estate hummed open to admit a pair of unmarked black utility vehicles. 2 United States Marshals stepped up to the front door, accompanied by a senior FBI financial crimes investigator. They wore dark suits and carried the distinct alert posture of men accustomed to handling high-stakes federal mandates. Judge Sterling guided them into the study and instructed me to present the evidence. I laid out the physical stock certificates first, proving my absolute legal ownership of the logistics company. Next, I presented the financial audits detailing the massive diversion of employee pension funds into offshore accounts, designed to cover Wesley's gambling debts. Finally, I played the digital audio recording of my stepson confessing to swapping Diane's heart medication with a lethal synthetic stimulant. The federal agents listened to the audio file twice in total silence. The sheer arrogance of Wesley's voice detailing the murder of his own mother to expedite an inheritance drained all skepticism from their expressions. The senior FBI agent looked at the stock certificates and then at the psychiatric warrant still displayed on the judge's secondary monitor. He stated that Abigail's fabricated police report was a textbook obstruction tactic, but it became legally void the moment I entered federal protective custody. The marshals agreed to place me under immediate federal protection as a material witness to a capital crime. They formulated a tactical perimeter strategy for the following morning. Local police protocols strictly require municipal officers to stand down when a suspect is actively escorted and claimed by federal marshals. The agents would personally escort me through the glass doors of my logistics headquarters, bypassing the private security mercenaries and neutralizing any threat of local arrest. They would physically secure the boardroom, allowing me to serve the freezing injunction directly to the corporate executives, while the FBI simultaneously arrested Wesley and Abigail for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. I thanked the officers for their swift intervention. For the first time since my digital identity was erased, I possessed the physical force necessary to match Wesley's aggression. I was no longer a hunted man running through subterranean tunnels. I was returning to my company surrounded by absolute federal authority. I spent the remainder of Sunday afternoon sitting in the quiet corner of Judge Sterling's study, meticulously refining the exact parameters of my impending confrontation. I did not allow the burning rage over Diane's murder to cloud my tactical judgment. Vengeance is a chaotic and sloppy emotion that often leads to critical, unforced errors. I had built a massive logistics empire by eliminating inefficiencies and operating with absolute clinical precision. I intended to dismantle Wesley's entire existence using that exact same methodology. I visualized the layout of the executive boardroom. I anticipated his initial shock, his rapid attempts at denial, and his inevitable pivot to aggressive intimidation. I resolved that I would not raise my voice. I would not afford him the satisfaction of witnessing my grief or my anger. I would simply walk into the room, invalidate his stolen authority with a single piece of paper, and watch the federal agents place him in irons. Mr. Hayes spent the afternoon drafting the final injunction paperwork, ensuring every legal loophole was permanently sealed. By early evening, the legal trap was perfectly set. I borrowed Mr. Hayes's secondary laptop to review the current corporate communications, accessing an administrative backdoor channel I had established years ago. I needed to verify the schedule of the private equity representatives. My eyes scanned the internal network traffic and locked onto a newly broadcasted mass email sent from Wesley's executive account to the entire corporate management structure. My heart rate spiked as I read the subject line. Wesley had somehow sensed a shift in the atmosphere. The email announced that the private equity executives were arriving early to avoid the morning traffic congestion. He was accelerating the timeline of the buyout. The final signing of the merger documents was no longer scheduled for midday. Wesley had officially moved the execution of the sale to 8 o'clock sharp on Monday morning. The morning sun broke across the Chicago skyline, casting long, sharp shadows through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the corporate headquarters. It was exactly 7:45 on Monday morning. The grand marble lobby, usually a subdued space of arriving executives and administrative staff, had been transformed into a theater of premature victory. Wesley stood near the center of the vast atrium wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that projected an air of absolute control. Beside him, Abigail adjusted the collar of her designer dress, her sharp eyes scanning the entrance. She held a crystal flute of expensive vintage champagne, the pale gold liquid catching the morning light. They were greeting the vanguard of the private equity acquisition team. 3 senior buyers, flanked by their own corporate counsel, stood in a tight circle with my stepson. Wesley laughed loudly at a remark made by the lead buyer, projecting the image of a seasoned corporate titan seamlessly transferring a logistics empire. He was entirely convinced that his trap had sprung perfectly. In his mind, the fraudulent psychiatric warrant had already been executed by the municipal police. He believed I was currently strapped to a clinical bed in a state facility, heavily sedated and legally muted, while he finalized the theft of my life's work. Abigail signaled to a catering waiter to refill the buyer's glasses. Her movements were brisk, betraying a lingering thread of nervous energy. But the overwhelming presence of the private equity funds masked her anxiety. She leaned in and whispered to Wesley, reminding him that the final signatures were required at 8 o'clock sharp in the executive boardroom on the 50th floor. The accelerated timeline was their ultimate insurance policy against any unforeseen bureaucratic delays. The private equity buyers raised their glasses in a toast to a lucrative transition, preparing to absorb a fleet of 3,000 transport vehicles and 4 automated distribution hubs. Wesley returned the gesture with a wide, arrogant smile. He had circumvented decades of my sweat and labor, orchestrated a lethal chemical manipulation to eliminate Diane, and weaponized the city police force against me. He felt utterly invincible, standing on the polished marble floor of the company I had built with my bare hands. He checked his heavy gold wristwatch. 15 minutes remained until the corporate entity officially belonged to the highest bidder. He gestured toward the private executive elevator bank, inviting the buyers to proceed upstairs to conclude the transaction. He turned his back to the main glass doors, completely oblivious to the storm gathering on the street outside. The heavy glass doors of the corporate headquarters offered an unobstructed view of the main plaza. At exactly 7:48, the morning traffic pattern was violently disrupted. 3 black, heavy-duty federal utility vehicles jumped the curb and parked at sharp angles directly across the primary pedestrian entrance, completely blocking the executive drop-off zone. The sheer aggressive suddenness of the arrival instantly drew the attention of the private security contractors patrolling the lobby. I stepped out of the lead vehicle into the crisp morning air. I wore a tailored navy suit, discarding the tactical wool sweater and work boots from my subterranean breach. I was no longer a ghost navigating maintenance tunnels. I was the founder and primary shareholder arriving to reclaim my territory. Mr. Hayes stepped out from the second vehicle, his briefcase gripped firmly in his right hand, his posture radiating legal authority. We were immediately flanked by 2 senior United States Marshals. The federal agents did not wear subtle corporate attire. They wore tactical vests bearing stark yellow federal lettering, their sidearms prominently displayed. They moved with a synchronized, blunt efficiency that commanded instant compliance from civilian bystanders. We advanced toward the main entrance in a tight, disciplined formation. Abigail had utilized stolen pension funds to hire an elite mercenary firm to secure the building against my entry. The tactical operatives stationed at the front desk immediately recognized the disruption. 4 heavily armored private security guards rapidly converged on the main glass doors to intercept our approach. They formed a physical barricade across the threshold, their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts. The lead security contractor, a broad-shouldered man with a military demeanor, raised his hand in a strict halt gesture. He announced loudly that the building was under a private executive lockdown and that no unauthorized personnel were permitted past the lobby desk. He locked eyes with me, clearly recognizing my face from the restrictive access profiles Abigail had distributed over the weekend. He specifically stated that I was legally barred from the premises and ordered me to step back toward the street. He reached for his radio to contact the municipal police, entirely confident in the fraudulent psychiatric warrant hanging over my name. I did not break my stride, nor did I utter a single word of protest. I allowed the machinery of federal law enforcement to operate exactly as Judge Sterling had intended. I maintained my clinical precision, refusing to engage in a shouting match with a hired contractor. I kept my eyes focused directly on the elevator banks deep inside the lobby. The senior United States Marshal stepped smoothly in front of me, closing the distance between our group and the private security barricade. The Marshal did not raise his voice, nor did he reach for his weapon. He simply reached into his tactical vest and produced his federal credentials, holding the gold shield inches from the lead contractor's face. He announced with cold, absolute authority that he was executing a federal mandate issued by the district court, and that any physical interference would result in immediate arrest for obstructing a federal investigation. The marshal explicitly informed the guards that their municipal warrants were entirely void, and that I was currently under the protective custody of the United States Department of Justice. The shift in power was instantaneous and absolute. The private security contractor stared at the federal badge, the color draining from his face. He instantly calculated the severe legal ramifications of fighting federal agents. He immediately lowered his hand and took a large step backward. He issued a sharp, silent command to his men. The mercenary barricade dissolved within seconds as the guards stepped aside, clearing a wide path through the main glass doors. I walked through the threshold of my own building, my footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor. The federal marshals maintained their flanking positions, securing our trajectory straight toward the executive elevator bank. Across the vast expanse of the lobby, the sharp sound of our entry cut through the celebratory atmosphere. Wesley, standing near the private equity buyers, paused mid-sentence. He turned his head toward the entrance to identify the source of the commotion. His arrogant smile froze instantly. He locked eyes with me across 50 yards of gleaming marble. I saw the exact moment his reality shattered. He recognized the federal vests. He realized I was not strapped to a psychiatric bed, but standing in his lobby with absolute authority. Raw, unfiltered panic flooded his expression. The carefully constructed facade of a corporate titan crumbled, leaving only the terrified face of a murderer cornered by his own hubris. Wesley dropped his champagne flute. The crystal shattered loudly against the floor, splashing wine across the polished stone. He spun around wildly and shouted a frantic command to his personal bodyguards stationed near the elevators. He ordered them to physically block the boardroom doors at all costs, desperately trying to seal the final perimeter before I could deliver the fatal blow. The 2 private bodyguards stationed outside the executive boardroom were not standard corporate security. They were hardened tactical operators hired specifically for their willingness to employ physical force to protect Wesley's interests. They moved with trained synchronization, planting their heavy frames directly in front of the frosted glass double doors leading into the main conference room. The taller of the 2 unclasped the retention strap on his holster, a clear and undeniable escalation of physical intent. He squared his shoulders, preparing to physically repel our advance. He vastly miscalculated the nature of the men flanking my sides. The federal marshals did not issue a verbal warning or engage in a posturing negotiation. They operated under the absolute authority of a federal mandate. In perfect unison, both marshals drew their issued sidearms. The metallic rasp of weapons clearing their holsters echoed sharply through the cavernous marble lobby. They leveled the barrels directly at the chests of the 2 bodyguards. The senior marshal barked a single deafening command to stand down and step away from the doors. He explicitly stated that any further movement toward their duty belts would be treated as an assault on a federal officer. The dynamic of the confrontation shifted in a fraction of a second. The bodyguards were paid exorbitant sums from the stolen pension fund to intimidate unarmed corporate rivals not to engage in a lethal firefight with the United States Department of Justice. The survival instinct immediately overrode their mercenary loyalty. The taller guard raised his hands in the air, his fingers splayed wide to demonstrate compliance. His partner mirrored the gesture, stepping backward and pressing his spine against the adjacent wall. The senior marshal kept his weapon fixed on the men moving with clinical precision to clear the primary pathway. He instructed his partner to secure their duty belts and strip them of their firearms. I did not pause to watch the disarmament process. I kept my eyes locked on the frosted glass doors, the final physical barrier standing between me and the men who had orchestrated my destruction. I had spent 40 years navigating hostile negotiations and cutthroat logistics contracts, but no boardroom battle had ever carried the weight of Diane's memory. I reached out and wrapped my hand around the polished steel handle of the heavy glass door. I pushed the heavy glass doors open with a forceful thrust, shattering the insulated quiet of the executive boardroom. The massive mahogany conference table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by plush leather chairs and panoramic views of the city skyline. The 3 private equity buyers were seated on the far side, their fountain pens poised over thick stacks of acquisition contracts. They looked up in unison, their expressions hardening into absolute confusion at the abrupt intrusion. Mr. Hayes stepped in directly behind me, securing the door, while the senior federal marshal took a stationary position just inside the threshold. Wesley scrambled backward from the head of the table. His tailored suit jacket caught on the armrest of his chair, tearing the expensive fabric. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, his face pale and contorted with raw panic. He shouted to the buyers that the meeting was temporarily suspended due to a severe security breach. Wesley's voice pitched into a frantic shriek as he desperately attempted to control the narrative. He declared that I was a completely delusional trespasser, suffering from advanced psychiatric degradation. He loudly instructed Abigail to immediately dial the municipal police dispatch, citing the fraudulent medical warrant they had filed over the weekend. He insisted that I posed an imminent physical threat to everyone in the room and demanded my immediate removal. The lead private equity buyer, a silver-haired man, accustomed to orderly financial transitions, stood up and demanded an explanation for the federal presence in the room. He looked at Wesley with mounting suspicion, questioning the integrity of the corporate environment. Wesley ignored the buyer entirely, his eyes darting frantically toward the glass walls, searching for the private security detail that had already surrendered. He shouted again, demanding to know why the local authorities had not intercepted me at the lobby entrance. He was banking his entire survival on the corruption of the local precinct and the bureaucratic sluggishness of the state medical board. He had never considered that a man he viewed as obsolete possessed the strategic foresight to bypass the municipal infrastructure entirely. Abigail fumbled with her cell phone, her hands shaking violently as she attempted to dial the emergency dispatch number. She echoed her husband's frantic accusations loudly, proclaiming that I had escaped a mandatory medical hold. Their performance was loud, chaotic, and utterly desperate. It was the exact opposite of the disciplined, silent precision I had utilized to orchestrate my return. I did not raise my voice to compete with Wesley's frantic shouting. Silence deployed at the correct moment is infinitely more devastating than noise. I walked slowly and deliberately to the head of the mahogany table, forcing Wesley to retreat further into the corner of the room. I unclasped the heavy brass buckle of my leather satchel. The room fell into a tense, suffocating quiet as the private equity buyers watched my every movement. I pulled the thick, worn leather binder from the satchel and placed it firmly onto the center of the polished wood surface. The dull thud of the binder striking the table resonated through the entire boardroom. Decades ago, when I secured my first commercial fleet loan, a skeptical bank manager told me that digital records could be manipulated, but physical ink bound in leather carried the undeniable weight of history. That lesson formed the foundation of my entire archive strategy. I turned my attention away from the trembling figures of Wesley and Abigail and focused entirely on the three private equity executives. I spoke with a calm, measured, and absolute authority. I introduced myself not as a former employee or a grieving widower, but as Howard, the founder, chief architect, and sole majority shareholder of the logistics corporation they were currently attempting to purchase. I informed them that the man cowering in the corner possessed zero legal authority to liquidate a single asset within this building. I stated that the digital transfers executed on Friday afternoon were fraudulent, and that the physical stock certificates resting on the table proved my 90% ownership. The lead buyer looked down at the leather binder, his eyes narrowing as he processed the profound legal implications of my statement. He realized instantly that the entire acquisition was built on a foundation of critical fraud. He demanded to know who had authorized the sale if the majority shareholder was standing right in front of him. Before I could present the federal freezing injunction, a sharp, aggressive voice cut through the tension. Abigail stepped forward from the corner of the room. She reached into her designer briefcase and pulled out a crisp, notarized legal document, holding it high in the air. She loudly and confidently declared that the stock certificates on the table were entirely obsolete, claiming she possessed definitive legal proof that I had voluntarily surrendered all corporate voting rights a decade ago. Abigail slapped a single sheet of paper onto the mahogany table. It was an impeccably forged waiver of voting rights, supposedly signed by me shortly after Diane and I were married. She spoke rapidly, her voice shrill and desperate, assuring the private equity buyers that my physical stock certificates were merely decorative relics of a superseded corporate structure. She urged them to ignore my sudden presence and proceed with the digital transfer immediately. Mr. Hayes did not even bother to look at her forged document. He stepped forward with absolute calm and placed his own document directly on top of hers. It was the federal freezing injunction, signed by Judge Sterling, bearing the unmistakable raised seal of the United States District Court. Hayes looked directly at the three private equity executives, ignoring Abigail completely. He informed the buyers that the woman screaming in the corner was currently under active federal investigation for document forgery and criminal conspiracy. He then slid the injunction across the polished wood, pushing it precisely into the hands of the lead buyer. Hayes stated in a clear, resonant voice that any signature provided by Wesley on any acquisition contract was instantly and legally void. He explained that a federal judge had officially recognized my possession of the physical stock certificates, thereby confirming my absolute control over 90% of the corporate voting power. Wesley's title as chief executive was suspended effective immediately by federal mandate. Hayes explicitly warned the buyers that any financial transaction executed with Wesley moving forward would be considered active participation in an ongoing racketeering enterprise. Abigail reached aggressively for the injunction, shrieking that it was a fabricated stalling tactic designed to ruin the merger. The senior federal marshal stepped forward and placed his heavy hand firmly on her shoulder. He informed her in a low, dangerous tone that touching federal evidence would result in her immediate handcuffing and removal from the premises. She shrank back against the glass wall, her face draining of color, as she finally realized the absolute supremacy of the federal agents occupying the room. The illusion of her control was completely shattered. The lead buyer ignored Abigail's breakdown entirely. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and began to review the federal injunction with intense scrutiny. The boardroom descended into an absolute suffocating silence. Only the crisp sound of the heavy parchment pages turning echoed in the vast space. The silver-haired executive read the preliminary findings detailed by Judge Sterling. I watched his expression shift rapidly from professional annoyance to profound corporate terror. He was not reading about a simple family dispute over voting rights or a minor administrative error. He was reading the clinical federally verified audit, proving that the company's massive employee pension fund had been entirely liquidated. He saw the undeniable paper trail linking the drained corporate accounts directly to offshore holdings and unregulated gambling syndicates. Mr. Hayes leaned over the table and pointed a steady finger to a specific paragraph near the end of the document. He quietly informed the buyer that Wesley was deliberately utilizing the accelerated Monday morning buyout to cover millions of dollars in stolen assets before the federal auditors discovered the missing funds. The buyer realized instantly that purchasing my logistics empire meant absorbing massive toxic debt and tying his pristine private equity firm directly to a federal criminal indictment for wire fraud and embezzlement. The legal and financial liability was catastrophic. The lead buyer slowly took off his glasses. He looked at Wesley with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He did not ask for an explanation. He did not offer an opportunity for renegotiation. He simply capped his expensive fountain pen and slid it into his suit pocket. He snapped his leather briefcase shut with a sharp, echoing click. Without saying a single word to my stepson, he signaled his two associate buyers. They immediately packed up their contracts and stood up in unison. Wesley panicked, stepping desperately into their path. He stammered out frantic promises of steep price reductions, complete indemnity agreements, and immediate risk offloading. The lead buyer shoved past him without a second glance. The three executives walked briskly out of the boardroom, flanked by the federal marshals, who ensured their safe and uninterrupted exit. The multi-million-dollar acquisition collapsed completely in less than 3 minutes. Wesley stood frozen near the head of the long table. He watched the heavy glass doors swing shut behind his corporate salvation. His posture deflated rapidly, his shoulders sagging as the reality of his total financial ruin crashed down upon him. He turned slowly to face me. The arrogant, untouchable executive who had smirked at me in the ground floor office just days ago was entirely gone. His skin was the color of wet ash, and a thick layer of nervous sweat coated his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words materialized from his trembling lips. I did not raise my voice. I did not show him a single ounce of the searing grief and rage that burned inside me over Diane's murder. I maintained the absolute clinical precision of an apex predator closing its jaws around its prey. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table, anchoring myself to the room. I formally invoked my 90% majority voting power as recognized and enforced by the federal court. I looked Wesley directly in the eyes and stated that his employment with my corporation was terminated effectively immediately. I methodically listed the grounds for his dismissal, citing gross financial negligence, massive fiduciary fraud, and the unauthorized liquidation of protected employee assets. I informed him that his corporate access, his executive salary, and his company-funded legal protections were permanently severed. I promised him that every single dollar he had stolen from the working men and women of this company would be extracted from his personal estate through relentless civil litigation. I stripped away every layer of his unearned privilege piece by piece in front of the federal agents waiting to arrest him for murder. Wesley stared at me, his chest heaving as his breathing turned shallow and frantic. The complete obliteration of his power, his wealth, and his freedom broke the final fragile thread of his sanity. The calculated mask of the sophisticated businessman evaporated completely, revealing the violent, desperate child underneath. He let out a raw, guttural scream of pure, unhinged hatred. He planted his hands on the polished wood and vaulted his entire body across the massive mahogany table, lunging directly at my throat, with his hands formed into fists. Wesley's body launched over the polished mahogany surface, his hands hooked into claws aimed directly at my windpipe. He never reached his target. The federal marshals stationed just inside the boardroom threshold reacted with the terrifying mechanized speed of men trained to neutralize sudden violence. Before Wesley could clear the center of the table, the senior marshal lunged forward, grabbing my stepson by the collar of his ruined bespoke jacket and the back of his leather belt. With a single brutal pivot of his hips, the marshal redirected Wesley's momentum entirely. He slammed Wesley face first into the solid wood surface with a sickening, heavy crack. The impact drove the air from Wesley's lungs in a sharp gasp, scattering the remaining corporate pens, crystal water glasses, and legal pads onto the floor. The second marshal was on him an instant later, burying a heavy knee into the small of Wesley's back, pinning him immovably against the table. Wesley thrashed wildly, his expensive shoes kicking uselessly against the air. But the combined weight of two federal agents made his physical resistance look like the flailing of a petulant child. The senior marshal grabbed Wesley's right wrist, twisting it sharply behind his back until the joint locked. The distinct, heavy ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs engaging echoed through the sudden stillness of the room. Wesley was entirely subdued, his cheek pressed flat against the mahogany, his breathing ragged and wet. He spat blood onto the polished grain and twisted his neck to look up at me. His eyes were wide with a feral, unadulterated hatred. He began to scream, his voice echoing off the glass walls of the 50th floor. He cursed my name, hurling vicious insults about my age, my background, and my obsolete methods. He screamed that I was a dead man, that his security contractors would return, that his lawyers would bury me in litigation until I died penniless in a state facility. He yelled that he had built this company's modern infrastructure, and that I was nothing but an ancient relic clinging to a throne that no longer belonged to him. He thrashed against the steel cuffs, ignoring the marshal's strict commands to cease resisting. The more he screamed, the more pathetic he appeared. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply stood at the head of the table, looking down at the architect of my wife's murder as he writhed in absolute defeat. I waited in absolute silence until Wesley ran out of breath. His screaming eventually devolved into heavy, pathetic panting as the cold reality of the steel cuffs bit deeply into his wrists. The senior marshal applied slightly more pressure to his back, ensuring total compliance. I looked down at my stepson, feeling absolutely no pity, only the cold satisfaction of absolute justice. I reached slowly into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and retrieved my encrypted cellular device. I unlocked the screen and navigated to the secure audio files containing the surveillance data gathered from the ground floor executive office. I held the device in my hand, adjusting the volume to its maximum setting. I told Wesley that his corporate theft and his financial mismanagement were trivial matters compared to his true crime. I pressed the play button. The pristine digital audio filled the silent boardroom, completely cutting through the lingering echoes of Wesley's tantrum. Abigail's frantic, panicked voice emanated from the small speaker, complaining bitterly about the life insurance investigator snooping around Diane's medical records. Then Wesley's own voice answered her. We all listened as the digital version of Wesley arrogantly boasted about emptying Diane's blood pressure capsules. We heard him explicitly detail how he replaced her vital medication with a lethal, untraceable synthetic stimulant to artificially trigger a fatal cardiac event. We heard him laugh about securing his inheritance ahead of schedule to cover his catastrophic gambling debts. The audio played continuously, laying bare the absolute depth of his depravity and the calculated cruelty of his actions. Mr. Hayes stood perfectly still, watching the color drain from the room. As his own recorded voice echoed off the glass walls, Wesley stopped thrashing entirely. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly translucent white. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as he realized the true nature of his arrest. The federal agents were not here merely for embezzlement or corporate fraud. They were here for a premeditated capital murder. The audio file concluded, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. Wesley squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body trembling violently against the mahogany table. He had no defense, no clever legal maneuvering, and no expensive lawyers who could erase a crystal-clear confession of matricide. He was completely, irrevocably destroyed. Across the room, Abigail stood perfectly rigid against the frosted glass wall. She had watched the entire physical takedown of her husband with wide, horrified eyes, but the audio recording had effectively paralyzed her. When she heard her own voice actively participating in the cover-up of her mother-in-law's murder, the sheer magnitude of her legal exposure crushed her. Every ounce of the haughty, calculated confidence she had displayed all morning evaporated. Her pristine designer dress suddenly looked like a prison uniform in waiting. The color completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. She realized with absolute clarity that Wesley was permanently ruined, and his sinking ship was tied directly to her ankles. She was no longer just an accessory to corporate fraud. She was an active participant in a federal murder conspiracy. Her survival instinct finally overrode her paralyzing shock. While the two federal marshals were entirely focused on securing Wesley against the conference table, Abigail began to move. She did not speak or make any sudden gestures. She slowly slid her expensive leather briefcase off the side table, gripping the handle with white knuckles. She kept her back pressed tightly against the wall, taking slow, silent steps toward the secondary exit at the rear of the executive boardroom. This door led directly to the private emergency stairwell, a discreet exit reserved for executive evacuations and secure departures. She kept her eyes locked on me, hoping my focus remained solely on her husband's collapse. She reached blindly behind her back, her trembling fingers wrapping around the brushed steel handle of the heavy wooden door. She pressed down on the latch, preparing to slip away into the stairwell and vanish before the authorities could officially link her to the homicide warrants. She pulled the door inward, a frantic spark of hope igniting in her eyes as the latch clicked open. That hope was instantly extinguished. The heavy wooden door swung open to reveal the imposing figure of a third federal investigator standing squarely on the other side. The agent wore a tactical vest identical to the marshal's inside the room, his posture rigid and uncompromising. He stepped forward, effectively blocking her only path of escape, his sheer physical presence pushing her back into the boardroom. The third federal investigator advanced into the room, his hand resting firmly on his holstered weapon. He did not issue a verbal command or offer a Miranda warning. He simply gripped Abigail by her upper arm with overwhelming force and guided her back toward the center of the boardroom. The sharp metallic clink of handcuffs echoed for the second time that morning as the agent secured her wrists tightly behind her back. The physical reality of the cold steel binding her hands instantly shattered whatever remained of her arrogant composure. Abigail did not maintain the stoic, calculated silence of a seasoned corporate conspirator facing litigation. She immediately began to weep, dropping to her knees on the plush carpet. She turned her tear-streaked face toward the federal agents and initiated a frantic, desperate confession designed entirely to deflect culpability. She shouted that Wesley had orchestrated the entire plot from the very beginning, claiming he had violently coerced her into accessing the hospital's digital mainframe. She insisted that she only altered Diane's medical charts and the autopsy directives because Wesley had threatened to destroy her career and expose her minor financial indiscretions from a previous firm. She portrayed herself as a terrified, abused spouse forced into compliance by a homicidal maniac. Wesley, still pinned forcefully against the mahogany table by the senior marshal, violently twisted his head to look at his wife. The sheer audacity of her betrayal ignited a new volcanic surge of rage within him. He spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor and began screaming curses at her. He loudly dismantled her fabricated narrative, revealing to the entire room that the original idea to accelerate the inheritance had been entirely hers. He shouted that Abigail had specifically researched the synthetic stimulant and sourced it directly through her dark web contacts. He detailed exactly how she had calculated the precise dosage required to mimic a natural cardiac arrest, assuring him the coroner would never run a specialized toxicology panel on an elderly woman with pre-existing hypertension. They tore each other apart in front of the federal authorities, their carefully constructed marriage dissolving into a vicious, desperate scramble for a reduced prison sentence. The three private equity buyers stood frozen near the main doors, watching the spectacular collapse of the couple who had nearly sold them a toxic nightmare. The federal agents did not interrupt the mutual destruction. They stood silently, allowing the suspects to freely provide overlapping, highly detailed confessions to a capital crime. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table observing the grotesque spectacle unfolding on the corporate carpet. Decades ago, when Wesley was a grieving teenager standing in my living room, I had promised Diane I would protect him. I had paid his university tuition, secured his first entry-level position in the logistics network, and spent years actively mentoring him to eventually inherit my legacy. I had overlooked his early arrogance, attributing his abrasive nature to a fierce ambition that simply needed proper molding. Diane had always believed her son carried a fundamental core of decency. Watching him now screaming profanities at his wife while desperately trying to bargain with federal agents, I realized exactly how deeply I had failed my wife's optimism. There was no decency left to salvage. I raised my hand, a silent, commanding gesture that immediately seized the attention of the room. The marshals stepped back slightly, allowing me an unobstructed view of the two prisoners. Wesley and Abigail fell silent, their chests heaving, their faces flushed with panic and profound betrayal. I looked down at them, ensuring my voice remained completely devoid of anger, sorrow, or sympathy. I delivered my final assessment with absolute, chilling clarity. I told Wesley that he had possessed everything a man could possibly ask for in this world. He had a guaranteed fortune, a thriving corporate empire, and a mother who loved him with a blinding, unconditional devotion. I told Wesley that Diane had spent her final days boasting to her friends about his recent promotion, completely unaware that her pride was the very catalyst for her murder. He had traded the life of the woman who birthed him to cover a gambling marker. I explained that his catastrophic failure was not rooted in poor financial strategy or bad investments. His failure was a fundamental rotting of his character. I stated plainly that greed had consumed his humanity long before it destroyed his freedom. I turned my gaze to Abigail, who was shivering violently against the base of the glass wall. I told her that she had entered this family seeking an expedited path to extreme wealth, completely willing to trade human life for a higher tax bracket. I assured both of them that the criminal justice system would strip away their designer suits, their luxury vehicles, and their unearned social status. They would spend the remaining decades of their natural lives locked in a concrete federal facility. I signaled to the senior marshal. I stated that the corporate transition was officially complete, and I requested the immediate removal of the trespassers from my property. The senior marshal nodded, hauling Wesley to his feet with a sharp jerk of his handcuffed arms. The third agent pulled Abigail up by her elbows, ignoring her continued desperate weeping. The heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open. The federal escorts marched their prisoners out into the 50th floor hallway. The executive assistants, administrative staff, and junior vice presidents had gathered in the corridors, drawn by the initial commotion and the sudden arrival of armed law enforcement. They stood in stunned, absolute silence as they watched the violent deposition of their corporate leadership. Wesley kept his head bowed, his face burning with a mixture of humiliation and terror, dragging his expensive shoes against the carpet. Abigail openly sobbed, her makeup smeared across her face, as the agents pushed her toward the freight elevator to avoid the main public lobby. The silent gauntlet of employees watched the former chief executive officer being marched out like a common street criminal. The absolute authority of my return was cemented in the minds of every individual in that building. I remained in the boardroom alongside Mr. Hayes. The silence in the room was heavy laden with the sheer exhaustion of a completed siege. I walked over to the panoramic window, looking down at the federal vehicles parked on the street far below. I watched the tiny figures of Wesley and Abigail being shoved into the back of the armored utility vehicles. The convoy merged into the heavy morning traffic, disappearing into the city grid, carrying the architects of my nightmare toward a federal holding facility. The physical threat was permanently neutralized. My life was no longer in danger, and the hostile corporate takeover had been violently aborted. However, the feeling of victory was entirely absent. Mr. Hayes slowly packed his legal documents into his briefcase. He cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. He informed me that the freezing injunction had successfully protected the physical assets of the logistics empire, but the internal financial landscape was a devastated wasteland. Wesley's desperate cover-up had failed, but his initial crime remained a staggering reality. The corporate pension fund, the financial lifeblood of 3,000 hardworking employees who had trusted me with their futures, was completely empty. The money had already been wired to untraceable offshore gambling syndicates. We had stopped the fraudulent sale, but I was now standing at the helm of a massive corporation, facing an immediate catastrophic internal financial collapse. I sat down in the heavy leather executive chair at the head of the boardroom table. The seat was still warm from Wesley's desperate occupation. The vast room, previously vibrating with the chaotic energy of a hostile takeover, was now entirely silent. Mr. Hayes remained standing near the panoramic window, his briefcase resting open on the polished mahogany. The immediate threat of Wesley's corporate theft had been neutralized by the federal injunction, but the collateral damage was catastrophic. Hayes turned to face me, his expression grave. He stated that the federal audit confirmed a zero balance in the primary employee pension accounts. Wesley had systematically funneled millions of dollars into offshore gambling syndicates to cover his catastrophic personal debts. 3,000 men and women, the drivers, mechanics, and warehouse operators who had built this logistics empire alongside me, were facing absolute financial ruin. They were weeks away from discovering their life savings had been vaporized. I did not allow panic to set in. Decades of managing complex supply chains had taught me that a crisis is merely a problem requiring an immediate, ruthless solution. I instructed Mr. Hayes to open his encrypted laptop and access the secure digital archive I had maintained separate from the corporate mainframe. I directed him to open 2 specific administrative files containing the authorization protocols for my private equity reserves. I told him to refer to this file by its name verbatim, Kich Bon Ong Da Den 2_23.docs, and the secondary ledger Kich Bon Ong Da Den Mao 1_23.docs. These documents contained the routing numbers for a series of private, untraceable offshore accounts I had established decades ago. When my logistics company first expanded internationally, I secured a massive influx of private capital. I never integrated that personal wealth into the corporate structure. I kept it hidden as a definitive failsafe against total systemic collapse. I authorized Mr. Hayes to immediately initiate a full liquidation of those private assets. I ordered him to wire the entire sum directly into the corporate pension fund, bypassing standard quarterly reporting, to ensure the employees never experienced a single disrupted payment. Hayes hesitated, warning me that liquidating those reserves would effectively erase my entire personal safety net. I looked him directly in the eye and stated that a leader does not allow his soldiers to starve while he hoards rations. The men and women on the loading docks were my responsibility. I would gladly trade my personal wealth to secure their futures and completely erase Wesley's destructive legacy. Leaving the corporate headquarters, I walked out through the main glass doors and into the bright, freezing morning. The federal utility vehicles were gone, taking Wesley and Abigail into the depths of the federal justice system. I instructed my personal driver to bring my vehicle to the front plaza. The drive back to the northern suburbs was quiet, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement, providing a stark contrast to the violence of the morning. I pulled through the heavy wrought iron gates of my estate. A local municipal police cruiser was parked directly in front of the main entrance. 2 patrol officers stood by their vehicle holding the active psychiatric warrant Abigail had fraudulently filed over the weekend. They placed their hands on their duty belts the moment I stepped out of the car, loudly instructing me to surrender for an immediate medical evaluation. I did not raise my voice or show any defensive hostility. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved the certified federal documents provided by Judge Sterling and the United States Marshals. I handed the sealed paperwork directly to the senior officer. The document explicitly detailed the ongoing federal criminal investigation, the immediate arrest of the individuals who had filed the fraudulent medical claim, and a federal mandate officially clearing my name of any psychiatric distress. The officer read the document twice, the hostility draining completely from his posture. He recognized the superseding federal authority and the severity of the crimes listed. He handed the papers back, offered a brief apology for the intrusion, and ordered his partner back into the cruiser. They drove off my property, effectively neutralizing the final trap Wesley had set. I walked up the stone steps and unlocked the front door. The house felt cavernous and empty, echoing with the absence of the violence that had plagued it for the past 48 hours. I immediately contacted a private security firm. Within the hour, a technician arrived to completely replace every lock digital keypad and access code on the property. I watched as the old mechanisms were stripped away and discarded. The physical boundaries of my home were permanently secured. Wesley and Abigail would never step foot on this property again. The breach in my sanctuary was permanently sealed. I walked into the kitchen, the familiar scent of old wood and quiet isolation wrapping around me. I moved with deliberate slowness, brewing a pot of strong black coffee. The mechanical rhythm of grinding the beans and pouring the boiling water grounded me in the present reality. I poured the dark liquid into a heavy ceramic mug and walked out onto the rear porch. The afternoon sun cast long golden rays across the sprawling garden Diane had cultivated with so much devotion. The vibrant colors of the late-blooming flowers stood in sharp contrast to the cold, clinical warfare of the past few days. I sat down in the wooden rocking chair, feeling the deep, aching exhaustion settle into my bones. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee, letting the heat burn away the lingering adrenaline. The silence of the estate was profound. It was not the suffocating, tense silence of a home anticipating an attack. It was the absolute, unyielding silence of a fortress that had successfully repelled a siege. I looked out over the meticulously manicured rose bushes, feeling a heavy, crushing wave of grief wash over me. I missed my wife with a physical intensity that constricted my chest. I missed her laugh, her quiet wisdom, and the warmth she brought to this massive, empty house. Wesley had stolen her from me out of pure, unadulterated greed, fracturing our lives for a fleeting financial payout. But as I stared at the garden she loved, the grief was accompanied by a deep, resonant peace. I had not allowed her murderer to escape into a life of luxury. I had not allowed her legacy to be dismantled by the parasites she had unknowingly harbored. I had utilized every ounce of my intellect, my resources, and my ruthlessness to expose the truth and tear their conspiracy down to the foundations. I had protected the people who depended on me and permanently removed the poison from our levees. I closed my eyes, letting the cool evening breeze wash over my face. The logistics empire I had built would continue to run with precise efficiency. The men and women who drove the trucks and managed the warehouses would wake up tomorrow completely unaware of the financial disaster that had almost destroyed their livelihoods. That was the true nature of executive responsibility. You absorb the impact so the structure remains intact. I opened my eyes and took a final sip of the black coffee. The storm that had threatened to consume everything was finally over. The debts were paid in full. The guilty were bound in federal chains. Silence and absolute order were completely restored. I sat down heavily in the leather executive chair at the head of the boardroom table. The seat retained a faint warmth from Wesley's desperate occupation just moments prior. The vast room, previously vibrating with the chaotic, frantic energy of a hostile corporate takeover, was now entirely silent. Mr. Hayes remained standing near the panoramic window, his leather briefcase resting open on the polished mahogany. The immediate threat of Wesley's corporate theft had been neutralized by the federal injunction, but the collateral damage was undeniably catastrophic. Hayes turned to face me, his expression grave and unyielding. He stated that the federal audit confirmed a zero balance in the primary employee pension accounts. Wesley had systematically funneled millions of dollars into offshore gambling syndicates to cover his catastrophic personal debts. 3,000 men and women, the drivers, mechanics, and warehouse operators who had built this logistics empire alongside me, were facing absolute financial ruin. They were mere weeks away from discovering their life savings had been vaporized by a spoiled heir. I did not allow panic to set in. Decades of managing complex global supply chains had taught me that a crisis is merely a problem, requiring an immediate, ruthless solution. I instructed Mr. Hayes to open his encrypted laptop and access the secure digital archive I had maintained entirely separate from the corporate mainframe. I directed him to open 2 specific administrative files containing the authorization protocols for my private equity reserves. I told him to refer to this file by its name verbatim, Kich ban ong da den hai gach dui hai mui bon cham dok x, and the secondary ledger Kich ban ong da den mau mot gach dui hai mui bon cham dok x. These highly classified documents contained the routing numbers for a series of private, untraceable offshore accounts I had established decades ago. When my logistics company first expanded internationally into new markets, I secured a massive influx of private capital. I never integrated that personal wealth into the corporate structure. I kept it hidden as a definitive failsafe against total systemic collapse. I authorized Mr. Hayes to immediately initiate a full liquidation of those private assets. I ordered him to wire the entire sum directly into the corporate pension fund, bypassing standard quarterly reporting, to ensure the employees never experienced a single disrupted payment. Hayes hesitated, warning me that liquidating those reserves would effectively erase my entire personal safety net. I looked him directly in the eye and stated that a leader does not allow his soldiers to starve while he hoards rations. The men and women on the loading docks were my absolute responsibility. I would gladly trade my personal wealth to secure their futures and completely erase Wesley's destructive legacy. Leaving the corporate headquarters, I walked out through the main glass doors and stepped into the bright, freezing morning air. The federal utility vehicles were completely gone, taking Wesley and Abigail deep into the unforgiving depths of the federal justice system. I instructed my personal driver to bring my vehicle to the front plaza. The drive back to the northern suburbs was exceptionally quiet, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement providing a stark contrast to the explosive violence of the morning. I pulled through the heavy wrought iron gates of my estate. A local municipal police cruiser was parked directly in front of the main entrance. Two patrol officers stood by their vehicle holding the active psychiatric warrant Abigail had fraudulently filed over the weekend. They placed their hands on their duty belts the moment I stepped out of the car, loudly instructing me to surrender for an immediate medical evaluation. I did not raise my voice or show any defensive hostility toward them. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved the certified federal documents provided by Judge Sterling and the United States Marshals. I handed the sealed paperwork directly to the senior officer. The document explicitly detailed the ongoing federal criminal investigation, the immediate arrest of the individuals who had filed the fraudulent medical claim, and a federal mandate officially clearing my name of any psychiatric distress. The officer read the document twice, the hostility draining completely from his rigid posture. He recognized the superseding federal authority and the profound severity of the crimes listed within the pages. He handed the papers back, offered a brief apology for the intrusion, and ordered his partner back into the cruiser. They drove off my property, effectively neutralizing the final pathetic trap Wesley had set. I walked up the stone steps and unlocked the front door. The house felt cavernous and empty, echoing with the absence of the violence that had plagued it for the past 48 hours. I immediately contacted a premium private security firm. Within the hour, a technician arrived to completely replace every lock, digital keypad, and access code on the entire property. I watched silently as the old mechanisms were stripped away and discarded into a metal bin. The physical boundaries of my home were permanently secured against any future intrusion. Wesley and Abigail would never step foot on this property again. The breach in my sanctuary was permanently sealed, restoring the physical integrity of the estate I had shared with my wife. I walked slowly into the kitchen, the familiar scent of old wood and quiet isolation wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. I moved with deliberate, measured slowness, brewing a pot of strong black coffee. The mechanical rhythm of grinding the dark beans and pouring the boiling water grounded me firmly in the present reality. I poured the dark liquid into a heavy ceramic mug and walked out onto the rear porch. The afternoon sun cast long, golden rays across the sprawling garden Diane had cultivated with so much boundless devotion. The vibrant colors of the late-blooming flowers stood in sharp contrast to the cold, clinical warfare of the past few days. I sat down in the wooden rocking chair, feeling the deep, aching exhaustion finally settle into my weary bones. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee, letting the intense heat burn away the lingering adrenaline coursing through my veins. The silence of the estate was profound and absolute. It was not the suffocating, tense silence of a home anticipating an imminent attack. It was the absolute, unyielding silence of a fortress that had successfully repelled a brutal siege. I looked out over the meticulously manicured rose bushes, feeling a heavy, crushing wave of grief wash over me. I missed my wife with a physical intensity that tightly constricted my chest. I missed her bright laugh, her quiet wisdom, and the undeniable warmth she brought to this massive, empty house. Wesley had stolen her from me out of pure, unadulterated greed, fracturing our lives for a fleeting financial payout. But as I stared at the garden she loved so deeply, the grief was accompanied by a deep, resonant peace. I had not allowed her murderer to escape into a comfortable life of luxury. I had not allowed her legacy to be dismantled by the parasites she had unknowingly harbored under our roof. I had utilized every ounce of my intellect, my accumulated resources, and my ruthlessness to expose the ugly truth and tear their conspiracy down to the very foundations. I had protected the thousands of people who depended on me and permanently removed the deadly poison from our lives. I closed my eyes, letting the cool evening breeze wash over my face. The logistics empire I had built would continue to run with precise, uninterrupted efficiency. The men and women who drove the trucks and managed the warehouses would wake up tomorrow completely unaware of the financial disaster that had almost destroyed their livelihoods. That was the true unsung nature of executive responsibility. You absorb the devastating impact so the structure remains completely intact. I opened my eyes and took a final sip of the black coffee. The storm that had threatened to consume everything was finally over. The debts were paid in full. The guilty were bound in federal chains. Silence and absolute order were completely restored. Reflecting upon absolute devastation that greed and unchecked ambition brought into my home, I recognized one profound truth that extended beyond corporate governance or familial duty. The ultimate lesson learned from this tragedy is that true power does not reside in the accumulation of vast wealth or the commanding of an empire, but in the unwavering willingness to sacrifice personal comfort to preserve the dignity and security of others. Wealth is merely a tool, an instrument, that can either corrupt the weak-minded or fortify the righteous. Wesley and Abigail viewed money as a weapon to conquer and destroy, allowing their insatiable desires to completely rot their fundamental humanity. Conversely, I utilized my hidden resources not to elevate my status, but to shield the innocent workers who relied upon my leadership, proving that wealth only possesses value when it is deployed to protect the vulnerable. Character is not forged during moments of victory, but during the darkest hours of grief and betrayal. We must always remain incredibly vigilant, guarding our personal sanctuaries against those who mistake genuine kindness for weakness and interpret generosity as an open opportunity to exploit. If this powerful story resonated deeply with your own personal experiences of surviving harsh betrayal and the relentless pursuit of absolute justice, please share your thoughts and reflections in the comments section below. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel today, and join our growing community as we continuously explore more life stories of incredible resilience, undeniable truth, and the unwavering defense of what truly matters in this life.